On the morning of January 23, 2026, President Donald Trump stood aboard Air Force One and delivered a message that sent shockwaves through the capitals of the Middle East. "We have an armada," he told reporters, his voice carrying the weight of American military power. "A massive fleet heading in that direction, and maybe we won't have to use it. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, cutting through waters that have witnessed centuries of imperial ambition, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln was racing toward the Persian Gulf. Accompanying the carrier were 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, the USS Spruance, the USS Michael Murphy, and the USS Frank E. Peterson, Jr., each armed with enough Tomahawk cruise missiles to devastate a small nation. Beneath the waves, invisible to satellites and radar, a fast attack submarine prowled alongside the strike group, its identity classified, its capabilities lethal beyond imagination. 5,000 American sailors and Marines were steaming toward a confrontation that could reshape the Middle East for generations to come. The day before, Britain had announced the deployment of 4 Typhoon fighter jets to Qatar, aircraft capable of launching Storm Shadow cruise missiles from over 150 miles away. At Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East, personnel had already begun evacuating, a precaution taken only when commanders expect the base to come under missile attack. In Tehran, the Supreme Leader's government had erected banners across the city showing the targets they had struck in June and bearing a chilling promise: it will happen again. This is the story of how the Islamic Republic of Iran arrived at the precipice of destruction, how a nation of 88 million people found itself staring down the barrel of American power. It is a story of revolution and massacre, of economic collapse and imperial hubris, of threats issued and armadas dispatched. And it begins not in January of 2026, but 7 months earlier, when Israeli jets screamed across Iranian airspace and changed the Middle East forever. Before we dive in, why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps this video reach more people. For 5 rounds of negotiations spanning from April to June of 2025, American and Iranian diplomats had met in secret locations across Europe, trying to resurrect some version of the nuclear deal that Trump had abandoned in his first term. Trump had given Tehran a 60-day deadline to reach an agreement, and when the 61st day arrived with no deal signed, Israel decided to take matters into its own hands. On June 13, 2025, Israeli Air Force jets launched the most ambitious military operation in the nation's history, a coordinated assault on Iran's nuclear facilities, air defenses, and ballistic missile infrastructure. The strikes hit Isfahan, where centrifuges had been spinning uranium to dangerous enrichment levels, and they hit military bases across the country where missiles capable of reaching Tel Aviv sat in hardened bunkers. Israeli intelligence had spent years mapping Iranian air defenses, and in a matter of hours, much of that defensive network lay in ruins, its radars blinded, its missile batteries destroyed. In the chaos that followed, Israeli operatives conducted car bombings that killed 14 Iranian nuclear scientists, the men and women who held the knowledge to rebuild what the bombs had destroyed. A strike on Evin prison, Iran's notorious facility for political prisoners, killed 79 people and sent a message that no target was beyond Israel's reach. 6 senior Iranian military commanders died in the opening days of the conflict, decapitating the command structure of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 9 days into the war, on June 22nd, the United States joined the fight with an operation codenamed Midnight Hammer, striking nuclear facilities that Israeli bombs had damaged but not destroyed. Iran fought back with everything it had, launching ballistic missiles at Israel's Nevatim Air Base, at the Haifa oil refinery, at power plants that kept Israeli cities illuminated. And in a move that would have consequences 7 months later, Iranian missiles struck Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a direct attack on American forces stationed on Allied soil. By the time a ceasefire took effect on June 24th at 4 o'clock in the morning Greenwich Mean Time, over 600 Iranians had been killed and more than 2,000 wounded. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared on Israeli television to declare a historic victory, claiming that Israel had removed two existential threats: Iran's nuclear program and its ballistic missile arsenal. President Trump, never one for understatement, declared that he had obliterated the Iranian nuclear threat. But in Tehran, amid the rubble and the funerals, the supreme leader and his advisors began planning their response, not through missiles, but through the slow reconstitution of everything they had lost. What neither Israel nor America fully appreciated was that the war had inflicted a wound far deeper than craters in concrete. It had shattered what remained of the Iranian economy. Before the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when the Shah still ruled from his peacock throne, $1 American could be exchanged for 70 Iranian rials. By the time of the nuclear deal in 2015, that exchange rate had deteriorated to 32,000 rials per dollar, a decline of over 45,000%. But the true collapse began when Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions that strangled Iran's ability to sell oil on international markets. After the 12-day war in June of 2025, the rial went into freefall, losing more than 40% of its remaining value in a matter of months. By January 7, 2026, $1 American traded for 1,460,000 Iranian rials, a currency so worthless that Iranians needed shopping bags full of cash to buy groceries. The Iranian central bank, in a desperate attempt to slow the bleeding, had maintained subsidized exchange rates for importers bringing in essential goods like food and medicine. But these subsidized rates had become a vehicle for corruption, with connected businessmen pocketing the difference between official and black market rates, while ordinary Iranians watched their savings evaporate. In the first days of 2026, the central bank announced it would end preferential exchange rates for all products except medicine and wheat, effectively abandoning the population to market forces. Inflation soared to record levels, food prices climbed beyond what working families could afford, and a devastating drought added agricultural catastrophe to economic ruin. For 45 years, the Islamic Republic had survived sanctions, wars, and protests by maintaining the loyalty, or at least the acquiescence, of the bazaris, the merchants and shopkeepers who form the commercial backbone of Iranian society. These were the same bazaris who had bankrolled the Islamic Revolution in 1979, who had provided the financial muscle that helped the Ayatollahs overthrow the Shah. Their alliance with the clerical establishment had been the foundation upon which the Islamic Republic was built. And on December 28, 2025, that foundation began to crack. It started in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, the ancient covered market that has been the beating heart of Iranian commerce for over 400 years. Shopkeepers who had watched their inventory become worthless, who could no longer afford to restock their shelves, who faced ruin through no fault of their own, began to close their metal shutters in protest. The strike spread from stall to stall, from alley to alley, until the Grand Bazaar, normally a cacophony of haggling and commerce, fell silent. Within days, the protests had jumped from the bazaar to the universities, from Tehran to Tabriz, from Mashhad to the oil towns of Khuzestan. What began as economic grievances, demands for relief from inflation and currency collapse, transformed into something the regime feared far more: political opposition. Crowds in the streets began chanting, "Death to Khamenei," directly challenging the supreme leader in a way that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. In a bitter twist that captured the regime's hypocrisy, protesters shouted, "Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran," rejecting the billions spent on foreign proxies while Iranians starved at home. By New Year's Eve, demonstrations had spread to all 31 of Iran's provinces, reaching over 280 locations across the country. The government responded by ordering closures in 21 provinces, effectively shutting down much of the nation, but the protests continued to grow. On January 5th, the head of Iran's judiciary, Gholam Hossein Mohseni Ejei, appeared on state television with a warning that would prove prophetic in the worst possible way. "I instruct prosecutors across the country to act with resolve against the rioters," he declared, "and to show no leniency or indulgence. The penalty will be decisive and maximum." What followed would become one of the largest massacres in modern Iranian history. On the evening of January 8, 2026, the Iranian government did something it had done before every major crackdown. It shut down the internet. Mobile phone networks went dark, international calls were blocked, and 88 million people were suddenly cut off from the outside world and from each other. Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content, so please hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps more than you think. With that said, let's get back to it. The blackout was unprecedented in its scope, more comprehensive than anything imposed during the 2009 Green Movement protests or the 2019 fuel price demonstrations. What happened next would only emerge in fragments, smuggled out through Starlink satellite connections and whispered through phone lines that occasionally flickered back to life. In the Tehran suburb of Fardis, witnesses reported that security forces opened fire on a crowd with machine guns, killing 50 protesters in a matter of minutes. Across the capital, snipers took positions on rooftops, targeting anyone who ventured into the streets. One Starlink message pleaded for help, reporting that shooters had been stationed behind the Tajrish Agh area in northern Tehran. A doctor in Tehran, communicating through encrypted channels, reported that over 217 protester deaths had been recorded across just 6 hospitals in the city, and those were only the bodies that made it to medical facilities. Iranian Nobel Peace Prize laureate Shirin Ebadi, monitoring events from exile, issued a desperate warning: a massacre is being planned under the cover of a sweeping communications blackout. One protester who managed to reach the outside world testified simply, "We saw hundreds of bodies." Hospitals in Tehran and Shiraz were overwhelmed with wounded protesters, many suffering gunshot wounds to the head and chest, evidence that security forces were shooting to kill, not to disperse. By January 10th, the human rights organization Iran International estimated that at least 2,000 protesters had been killed in just 48 hours of violence. 2 days later, Time magazine reported that the death toll might have reached 6,000, based on reports from hospitals that did not include bodies taken directly to morgues. On January 13th, Iran International updated its estimate: at least 12,000 dead, possibly as many as 20,000. A network of Iranian doctors working in secret compiled their own figures and reached a horrifying conclusion. Between 16,500 and 18,000 people had been killed, with 330,000 injured. The regime, unable to suppress the uprising with Iranian forces alone, made a decision that revealed the depths of its desperation. According to reports that emerged days later, Iraqi Shia militia fighters were recruited to help crush the protests, offered $600 each to cross the border and kill Iranian civilians. By January 15th, CNN reported that nearly 5,000 Iraqi militia members had entered Iran. Foreign fighters brought in to massacre the very people the Islamic Republic claimed to represent. Witnesses in Kurdish regions reported that the security forces shooting protesters did not speak Persian. In the city of Karaj, survivors said the killers spoke Arabic and paused to take selfies with the bodies. Reports emerged of chemical agents being deployed against crowds, with footage showing security forces in hazmat suits and gas masks. Victims died not immediately but days later, suggesting exposure to toxic substances. Detained protesters reported being injected with unknown substances while in custody, their fates unknown, their families forbidden from asking questions. The Tehran prosecutor announced that protesters would be charged with mohareba, waging war against God, an offense punishable by death under Islamic law. By January 22nd, the regime admitted that 3,117 people had been killed, a figure that human rights organizations dismissed as a fraction of the true toll. The same day, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran stated that the actual death toll might surpass 20,000. In 3 weeks of violence, the Islamic Republic had killed more of its own citizens than had died in the 12-day war with Israel. From the moment the first protesters fell in Tehran's streets, Donald Trump saw an opportunity that aligned perfectly with his instincts: maximum pressure on maximum display. On January 4th, as reports of the first deaths reached Washington, Trump issued a warning that Iran had heard before, but never quite like this. The United States will hit Iran hard if the regime continues to violently target protesters as it has done in the past. the president declared, his words broadcast around the world. The next day, he posted on Truth Social that America was locked and loaded, language that suggested military action was not merely possible but imminent. Inside Tehran, according to Iranian officials who spoke to Reuters, Trump's threats created panic at the highest levels of government. Some officials fear that the United States may target Iran after the January 3rd strikes in Venezuela, one Iranian source admitted, referring to the Delta Force operation that had captured Nicolas Maduro just 48 hours earlier. That operation, completed in 2 hours and 28 minutes, had demonstrated that Trump was willing to use American special forces to remove leaders he considered enemies. Another Iranian official confessed that external pressure had narrowed the regime's options. Few viable paths and high risks on every path. The regime faced an impossible dilemma: crush the protests and invite American intervention, or show restraint and risk appearing weak to a population that had lost its fear. They chose to crush the protests anyway, gambling that Trump's threats were bluster. On January 10th, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei acknowledged that protesters' demands were completely fair, then ordered his forces to put the rioters in their place. Trump responded by reiterating his threat: if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, the United States would come to their rescue. Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid, watching events unfold, offered Tehran a pointed warning. The regime in Iran should pay close attention to what is happening in Venezuela. By mid-January, American intelligence officials described the situation as an endurance game, the opposition trying to keep pressure on until key figures fled or switched sides, the regime trying to terrorize the population into submission without giving America justification to strike. Then, on January 15th, something changed in Trump's calculus. Behind closed doors, a frantic diplomatic campaign was underway to prevent American military action. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Oman, nations that would bear the brunt of Iranian retaliation, led efforts to convince Trump that strikes would destabilize the entire region. A senior Saudi official told reporters that the Gulf states feared grave blowbacks from American intervention, consequences that would fall on their cities and their oil infrastructure. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, according to American officials, urged Trump to delay any attack, a remarkable request from a leader who had spent years demanding military action against Tehran. Senior advisors warned Trump that a large-scale strike was unlikely to topple the regime and could instead unite Iranians against a common enemy, strengthening the very government he wanted to destroy. The Pentagon raised practical concerns. Most American military assets had been surged to the Caribbean for the Venezuela operation, leaving insufficient forces in the Middle East to both strike Iran and defend against retaliation. There was no aircraft carrier in the Gulf region, no adequate defense against the barrage of missiles Iran would certainly launch at American bases. On January 16th, Trump emerged from the White House and told reporters he had decided against strikes, for now. "Nobody convinced me, I convinced myself," he insisted, claiming he had received assurances on good authority that the killing of protesters had stopped. He went further, claiming that 800 planned executions of protesters had been halted because of his threats, a claim Iranian officials flatly denied. But Trump made clear that his patience was not infinite. If Iran resumed its nuclear program, if the killing resumed, if Tehran threatened him personally, the calculus would change. "I hope they're not trying to build up again," he warned, "because if they are, we're going to have no choice but very quickly to eradicate that buildup." The regime in Tehran, having survived 3 weeks of protests that killed more than 20,000 of its citizens, interpreted Trump's restraint as permission to finish the job. While Trump deliberated, Iran's leadership issued threats of their own, warnings that any American attack would trigger a regional apocalypse. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, writing in the Wall Street Journal, delivered a message stripped of diplomatic niceties. "Unlike the restraint Iran showed in June 2025, our powerful armed forces have no qualms about firing back with everything we have if we come under renewed attack. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf announced that in the event of American strikes, both the occupied territory, Iran's term for Israel, and American military and shipping assets would become legitimate targets. The newly formed Iranian Defense Council issued its most ominous warning yet. Iran would not wait to be attacked, but would strike preemptively if it detected clear signs of an imminent threat. Across Tehran, the regime erected banners showing the targets Iranian missiles had struck in June: Israel's Nevatim Air Base, the Haifa refinery, Udeid in Qatar, with the words, "It will happen again," displayed above each image. IRGC spokesman Brigadier General Mohammad Ali Nayani warned Israel to remember the blows it received before contemplating another war. Senior advisor Ali Shamkhani declared that Iran's missile and defense capabilities were non-negotiable, and that any aggression would face a devastating response. The regime was betting that the threat of regional war, missiles raining on Tel Aviv and Riyadh, oil tankers burning in the Strait of Hormuz, would stay America's hand. For a few days, that bet appeared to be paying off. But then the USS Abraham Lincoln began moving west. On January 14th, somewhere in the South China Sea, the USS Abraham Lincoln received orders to change course, not toward Taiwan, where China was conducting provocative military exercises, but toward the Persian Gulf. The carrier strike group, a floating city of 5,000 sailors equipped with FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, and E-2D Hawkeye early warning planes, began its transit toward the Middle East. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Darrell Caudle had recently boasted that the Navy could reposition carrier strike groups anywhere on the globe in under 2 weeks. Now that capability was being put to the test. At Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which normally hosts 10,000 American service members, evacuation orders went out for non-essential personnel. The British began evacuating their own personnel from Udeid, a clear signal that London expected the base to come under Iranian missile attack. A new coordination cell was established at Udeid specifically for integrated air and missile defense, military jargon for shooting down the barrage that everyone expected Iran to launch. Additional Patriot missile batteries and THAAD systems, America's most advanced missile defense platforms, were ordered to the region. C-17 Globemaster cargo aircraft began appearing on flight trackers, hauling equipment and ammunition to bases across the Gulf. The State Department issued advisories warning Americans to limit travel to the region and urging any citizens in Iran to leave immediately. On January 22nd, as the Abraham Lincoln transited the Malacca Strait, Britain announced the deployment of 4 Typhoon fighter jets to Qatar. Defense Secretary John Healey framed the deployment as defensive, but the Typhoons were armed with Storm Shadow cruise missiles capable of striking targets deep inside Iran. The jets would operate from bases just across the Persian Gulf from Iranian territory, close enough to respond to any attack, close enough to participate in any strike. By January 23rd, when Trump confirmed the massive armada heading toward Iran, the military buildup was unmistakable. Destroyers already in the region, the USS McFall and USS Mitchell, took up positions alongside 3 littoral combat ships, forming a defensive screen around Gulf oil infrastructure. In Saudi Arabia, a multinational exercise called Spears of Victory 2026 brought together aircraft from the United States, Britain, France, Pakistan, and 6 other nations, a show of force that Tehran could not ignore. The pieces were on the board, the Armada was in motion, and the question that hung over the Middle East was whether Trump would order the strike. While American forces converged on the Gulf, Israel maintained what observers called strategic silence, a notable departure from the usual bombast that accompanied any confrontation with Iran. The reasons for Netanyahu's restraint were tactical. With the regime already besieged by protests and threatened by Trump, there was little upside in Israeli saber-rattling that might unite Iranians against a common enemy. But behind the silence, Israel was preparing for the next round. On January 5th, Netanyahu had convened a 5-hour meeting of the Security Cabinet to discuss timing and staging for renewed strikes against Iran. An operation codenamed Iron Strike had been approved, with Netanyahu presenting the results of his discussions with Trump at their December meeting in Florida. Israeli intelligence was conducting military exercises simulating war scenarios with Iran, while Defense Minister Israel Katz and Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir reviewed battle plans. In conversations with American officials, Netanyahu had raised the possibility of round 2 strikes in 2026, arguing that further action might be necessary to prevent Tehran from rebuilding its nuclear and missile capabilities. Trump had signaled his support, telling reporters that if Iran attempted to reconstitute its nuclear program, we're going to destroy it again. A senior American official explained the understanding between Washington and Jerusalem. Trump would likely back renewed Israeli strikes if the United States saw real and verifiable steps toward nuclear reconstitution. The tension, the official admitted, will be in agreeing what reconstitution means. Israeli officials had warned the Trump administration that a recent Iranian missile exercise could be cover for a preemptive strike, a sign of how close both sides believed they were to renewed conflict. At the weekly cabinet meeting on January 11th, Netanyahu broke his silence just long enough to deliver a message to the Iranian people. "We are sending strength to the heroic and courageous citizens of Iran," he declared, "and once the regime falls, we will do good things together for the benefit of both peoples." It was a vision of reconciliation, but one predicated on the destruction of the government that currently ruled 88 million Iranians. By January 18th, the protests that had shaken the Islamic Republic to its foundations had been largely crushed. Heavy police presence on every street corner, the memory of thousands of dead, and the fear of torture and execution had driven demonstrators from the squares and back into their homes. Tehran, which had echoed with chants of "death to Khamenei" just days before, fell into an uneasy silence. The regime organized counter-rallies, busing in government supporters to demonstrate that the Islamic Republic still commanded loyalty, or at least the appearance of it. Supreme Leader Khamenei emerged to thank the pro-government demonstrators and to blame the violence on the United States and Israel, calling all protesters rioters and terrorists affiliated with foreign governments. He acknowledged that thousands of people had been killed but accepted no responsibility, instead accusing Trump of orchestrating the bloodshed. From exile, Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah, called on Iranians to continue their resistance. "Between us and this regime lies an ocean of the blood of Iran's children," he declared, promising that, "Together we will take Iran back and rebuild it anew." In London, protesters tore down the Islamic Republic's flag from the Iranian embassy and raised the lion and sun banner of pre-revolutionary Iran. The social media platform X changed its Iranian flag emoji to the pre-revolution design, a small symbol of solidarity with a movement that had been drowned in blood. But symbols could not resurrect the dead, and the streets of Tehran remained quiet. As of January 24, 2026, the USS Abraham Lincoln continues its transit toward the Persian Gulf, expected to arrive within days. British Typhoons sit on the tarmac in Qatar, their pilots briefed on Iranian air defenses, their missiles ready for launch. Iran's military remains on high alert, its missile batteries pointed at American bases and Israeli cities, its leadership convinced that any sign of weakness will invite destruction. The protests have been suppressed, but the economic conditions that sparked them remain unchanged. The rial is still worthless, inflation still soars, and millions of Iranians still cannot feed their families. The question that hangs over the Middle East is not whether another confrontation will come, but when. Trump has made clear that certain actions will trigger American strikes, resumed nuclear activity, mass executions of protesters, any threat against his life. Iran has made equally clear that any attack will be met with overwhelming retaliation. Against American bases, against Israeli cities, against the oil infrastructure that powers the global economy. Between these red lines, diplomats from Qatar and Oman scramble to find a path to negotiation, warning that military action would unleash consequences neither side can control. Netanyahu waits in Jerusalem, Operation Iron Strike approved and ready, for the moment when American support aligns with Israeli operational planning. And in Tehran, Ayatollah Khamenei, 86 years old and in declining health, faces the possibility that the revolution he has led for 36 years may not survive the decade. The 12-day war of June 2025 was supposed to have settled the question of Iran's nuclear ambitions, but ambitions do not die as easily as centrifuges. The protests of January 2026 were supposed to have broken the regime's grip on power, but tyrannies have survived worse and emerged stronger. What comes next depends on calculations being made in Washington and Tehran, in Jerusalem and Riyadh, calculations that weigh the risk of war against the risk of inaction. For Trump, the Armada represents leverage, a massive fleet that can strike or sail away depending on whether Iran bends to American demands. For Iran, the Armada represents an existential threat, proof that the United States and Israel intend to finish what they started in June. For the people of Iran, who have buried their children and watched their savings evaporate, the Armada represents something else entirely, the bitter knowledge that their fate lies in foreign hands. They rose up against a regime that had failed them, and that regime killed them by the thousands. They appealed to the world for help, and the world answered, not with empty words, but with the unmistakable signal that the free world stands ready to act. The revolution they hoped for may yet come, and this time they will not stand alone. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the USS Abraham Lincoln cuts through the waves, its aircraft ready, its missiles armed, its destination certain. Whether it will fire those missiles or simply wait offshore as a symbol of American power is a decision that has not yet been made. But one thing is certain. The Islamic Republic of Iran has never been weaker, never been more isolated, and never been closer to the moment when its enemies decide that its time has finally come. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for watching.